All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and good morning to our friends in the West, and good evening to our friend in London. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. This webinar is going to make a case for applying food as medicine for autoimmune disease. I'll be facilitating. I'm Alan Shannon. I'll introduce myself in a minute. Our speakers, Dr. Joel Kahn and Brian Bentow, have a breadth of experience and insights that they'll share with us shortly. Please note that we'll be recording this webinar. For today's webinar, we've invited clinicians, healthcare administrators, government officials, registered dietitians, producers, suppliers, and mealtime lovers, and we probably have a couple others out there. So welcome to everybody. And we have nearly every sector that's interested in food as medicine on this webinar. So let's get started. As I mentioned, welcome again to our Food as Medicine webinar. We're thrilled to have such a diverse group of attendees today, from healthcare professionals, as I mentioned, to culinary experts and food enthusiasts. Your presence here underscores a shared commitment to healthier communities. Here's the agenda for today's webinar. The agenda is going to be packed with information, a lot of data, a lot of insights, experience from Joel and Brian that they'll be sharing with you. We'll kick off with a welcome introduction, and then we'll hear from Dr. Joel Kahn. He'll dive into the impact of using food as medicine for autoimmune diseases. And then following that, Brian will share his personal journey of managing Crohn's disease and how the Get Saucy approach played a pivotal role in his healing. After the presentations, we'll open the floor for an interactive Q&A session with our expert panel. Please use the chat function. Some of you are already doing that, both for your questions and comments. And we encourage you to actively participate and share your questions. And after we address questions toward the end of the webinar, we'll discuss next steps and we'll provide you with valuable resources as well as information on how you can connect with all of us. Remember that chat is also open for resource sharing, so keep an eye on that. If you've got a link or something that you'd like to share, please feel free to put that in the chat. And before we proceed, a quick reminder, this webinar is for educational purposes and not a substitute for professional medical advice. We're here to facilitate learning and discussion, so let's please engage respectfully and thoughtfully. Thank you for being here, and let's get started. To start, I'll share a little information on my background. I'm super excited to facilitate this important conversation. As the Public Affairs Director for USDA's Food and Nutrition Service in the Midwest region, from 2009 to 2025, just this past April, I retired. I led communications for our country's nutrition programs during pivotal national initiatives and crises. So the nutrition programs are School Meal, SNAP, WIC, and the like. And notably, I played a key role during the Flint water emergency and First Lady Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign, as well as USDA's strengthening of school meal nutrition standards. While in this role, I also built and facilitated numerous national and regional networks that focus on advancing food systems, reducing hunger, and fostering healthcare partnerships. In 2010, I began working with healthcare organizations in the Midwest. They were early adopters and looking at the connection between food and health. To initiate the conversation, I convened at the time 7 healthcare providers, Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, and then some health insurers like Blue Cross Blue Shield in Michigan and Minnesota, to have an initial meeting to share approaches and ways to leverage federal programs and to connect with USDA, other federal agencies, and each other. When I left USDA at the end of April, the network was approaching 700 members, from 7 to 700. It's a powerful demonstration of the growth and interest in this work and the number of organizations across the spectrum who are interested in tackling improved nutrition and its many facets. These efforts have engaged thousands of providers and organizations, and my work has been featured across major media outlets. Now that you know a little about me, let's turn to the topic of this webinar, autoimmune diseases. I'll start by sharing some eye-popping statistics about autoimmune and diet-related disease. For starters, over 25 million Americans are living with autoimmune diseases. That's about 7.6 to 9.4% of the population, a lot. There are more than 150 different autoimmune diseases with substantial economic implications for all of us. You can also see that the prevalence of the disease is increasing. When we consider diet-related diseases, the annual cost reaches a staggering 1.1 trillion. That's with a T, not billion. The crisis presents both a challenge and an opportunity. By addressing the root causes through food as medicine interventions, there's potential, for example, for $4.5 billion savings annually for Social Security, given the number of Americans who qualify for disability because of an autoimmune disease. Also, for every 1,000 US employees living with such conditions, healthcare and lost work costs amount to $580,000. These sobering statistics highlight the urgent need for effective solutions and the transformative potential of food as medicine. As we proceed, we'll explore how these interventions can make a real difference in both personal health and broader economic terms. During this webinar, we'll walk through the evidence for applying food as medicine to autoimmune diseases, the cost savings and benefits for doing so, and a practical means for implementing it. As a reminder, we'll also provide time for Q&A. So as you have questions as we go through, go ahead and pop them in the chat, and we'll address those toward the end. Now, I'm super excited to turn things over to our first speaker, Dr. Joel Crohn. He's going to share some more information on the background, research, and data around autoimmune disease. Dr. Crohn?
Hi, thanks, Alan. Hi, my name is Joel Crohn. I've been exploring the intersection of business, healthcare, and technology for more than 25 years as a physician and executive. I was trained as an internist and did a fellowship in medical informatics. Since then, I have focused on population health and the business side of medicine, and I've worked as a medical director at Aetna and as an executive for a number of healthcare technology and mindfulness companies. While studying mindfulness, I became interested in how health coaching can also improve the lives of patients. So I joined the American College of Lifestyle Medicine and became board certified as a health and wellness coach. Now, in addition to seeing my coaching clients, I work as a consultant to and advisor to healthcare companies. When I went to medical school many years ago, the focus was clear. We studied how the body works, how it can fail, and what treatments might fix it. On Friday afternoons, there was a brief course that touched on medicine's role in society and the softer side of being a physician. But prevention and nutrition, those topics were almost non-existent. Since then, medicine has changed dramatically. Today, there's a much deeper understanding of the power of prevention, and many doctors not only believe in its value, but also in strategies that truly help people change their behavior. One of the most impactful approaches is known as food as medicine. This concept brings high-quality food directly into medical care as a way to prevent, manage, and treat disease. It takes shape in many ways, programs like SNAP, WIC, and school meals, produce prescriptions, and medically tailored groceries and meals. Each of these efforts works to close the gap between healthcare and access to nutritious food, placing nutrition at the foundation of better health. The body is an amazing entity. It is able to mount an immune response to a whole host of foreign antigens, for example, proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, viruses, etc. An autoimmune disease occurs when the immune system, which normally defends the body against infections while ignoring healthy tissue, mistakenly attacks the body's own cells. In these conditions, B cells may produce autoantibodies, while T cells contribute through autoreactive responses, such as directly damaging tissues or overstimulating immune activity. Together, these misdirected actions lead to chronic inflammation and tissue damage. In order to explain why some patients develop autoimmune diseases later in life, modern medicine has developed the second hit hypothesis. A patient first must have a genetic predisposition to developing the disease, and then a secondary environmental trigger, like an infection, air pollution, stress, microbiome disruption, etc., precedes the autoimmune disease development. Once the autoimmune disease begins, it typically continues throughout the rest of the patient's life. The second hit hypothesis explains why family history is a strong determinant of autoimmune disease. There are more than 80 recognized autoimmune diseases. Some sources list over 150, affecting organs such as the nervous system, joints, gut, and skin. Common examples include lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes, and inflammatory bowel disease. As noted earlier, these diseases cost us greatly through healthcare spending, higher health insurance rates, and lost productivity and related costs to American businesses. Celiac disease is one such an example of an autoimmune disease. The mechanisms for celiac disease have been studied and is now well understood. Gluten is broken down by the digestive system into various peptides, including gliadin. The gliadin crosses the intestinal barrier where it binds to specific HLA genes on antigen-presenting cells. In people with celiac disease, the TTG enzyme is abnormally increased and it deaminates the gliadin, which increases its binding to antigen-presenting cells. These complexes are presented to T cells and create an inflammatory response, which attacks the intestinal lining, causing damage to it, decreasing its ability to absorb nutrients and increasing its permeability, causing leaky gut, which also increases the inflammatory response. In order to suppress this immune reaction, doctors used to prescribe steroids and other anti-inflammatories, ultimately surgically removing part of the intestines in patients who didn't respond to medication. However, today, the standard of care for celiac disease is the gluten-free diet, which has been shown to be highly effective. Celiac patients who are able to remain adherent to a gluten-free lifestyle see a significant improvement in their quality of life. The biggest problem they face, however, is staying on the diet, even though the number of gluten-free products has increased dramatically over recent years. As mentioned earlier, the body has many ways to attack foreign invaders. IgE-mediated allergies cause an immediate reaction that can sometimes be life-threatening. The FDA has identified the top 9 food triggers as wheat, dairy, eggs, fish, shellfish, tree nuts, peanuts, soybeans, and sesame. Currently, doctors instruct patients with an IgE-mediated life-threatening food allergy to carry an EpiPen and to avoid those foods. And as mentioned earlier, doctors instruct patients with celiac disease, an IgA-mediated immune disorder, to avoid gluten. Why hasn't identifying and avoiding food triggers become the first-order treatment plan for autoimmune disease? Unfortunately, there are several challenges for doctors to apply the same avoidance strategy to other autoimmune chronic diseases. First, while there are reliable tests for food allergies, such as nuts, sesame, wheat, etc., there are no standard and reliable diagnostic tests to identify other types of food sensitivities other than celiac disease. Second, 2 patients with the same diagnosis, such as Crohn's disease, can have different food triggers, unlike celiac disease, where gluten is the same trigger for every patient. Finally, while there are many gluten-free products on the market, there are relatively few products that are free of all of the most common food triggers, and doctors don't have an easy means to prescribe a diet to patients and help them maintain adherence. As a result, the most commonly prescribed treatments are similar to what was offered to celiac patients many years ago: broad-based immunosuppressive therapies, which are costly and potentially harmful. So what has been tried? The foundation for nearly all of these diets is the same: eat whole foods with lots of vegetables and avoid ultra-processed ingredients like refined sugar, refined grains, artificial colors, flavors, and trans fats. In the past, there has been mixed success with dietary interventions like the Mediterranean diet, specific carbohydrate diet, paleo diet, etc. for autoimmune diseases. The diet seemed to work for a patient by what they exclude and not by what they include. If a diet excludes the patient's food triggers and meets their nutritional needs, it will work just like a gluten-free diet for a celiac patient. I understand this chart is packed with info, so I won't review it, but for those interested in taking a closer look, we'll share this graphic at the end of the webinar. Hippocrates in the 4th century BC supposedly said, "Let thy food be thy medicine." Since then, there have been great many strides in using foods as medicine to help with heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, and many other conditions. It's only been in the past 15 years or so that people have begun applying food as medicine interventions to autoimmune disease. And so far, the results have been extremely promising. There is good research showing improvements with Crohn disease, ulcerative colitis, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and others. And while there has been no direct studies comparing medications to diet, some of the results have been better for dietary interventions than medications. The main idea behind the autoimmune protocol is to start with an elimination diet that removes certain immunogenic foods, including grains, seeds, nuts, eggs, dairy, legumes, and nightshade vegetables, which include tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, etc., and then evaluating one's response over the ensuing 1 to 3 months. Although most people, if they are food responsive, will see a rapid improvement in the first 4 to 6 weeks. Then there is a slow reintroduction of one food at a time to see if there is regression. If not, then another food can be added, thus eventually allowing one to discover what foods are triggering their autoimmune condition. Now let's see how this dietary intervention compares to standard of care. Scenario A is the current standard of care. Patients then don't have to do anything different than normal, but they have to get a shot every 2 weeks and get regular blood testing. In addition, they run the risk of rare but serious complications, including the risk of infections because of a weakened immune system. Scenario B is offering patients medically tailored meals in lieu of them trying to make their own AIP meals. This is easy for patients, but they are limited to the meals provided, and MTM may not be available to everyone geographically. Scenario C is providing the basis for making your own meals with AIP-approved sauces, seasonings, etc. This allows people who are interested in taking more control of their diet to cook for themselves, giving them the greatest flexibility. From the perspective of cost to the healthcare system, Scenario C is much less expensive. In addition, Scenario A doesn't factor in the cost of complications of a biologic, such as the cost of pneumonia, MI, or other complications. Now let's explore a case study of standard of care versus the AIP diet. This case study has not been done, so it's a hypothetical case using the best data we have from published studies. Studies have shown that only about 46% of IBD patients respond to a biologic, whereas about 73% of patients respond to the AIP. Therefore, if we look at a cohort of 100 Medicare beneficiaries, all with severe IBD, we find that 46 respond to biologics and 73 respond to dietary intervention. If you look at the cost of intervention, the cost of biologics would be about $655,000. The cost of medically tailored meals is about $800,000. And just providing the sauces is $173,000. You also have to take into consideration the ongoing care for the responders and the non-responders. Of course, there's many fewer non-responders in the dietary intervention. Now, when you look at cost savings from the perspective of the healthcare system, there is a $17,000 savings per patient per year with medically tailored meals, and there's an even larger $24,000 savings with Scenario C. We can also compare how dietary interventions might play out for a larger set of autoimmune conditions. This list includes inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, psoriasis, and multiple sclerosis. You'll notice we gave information broken down by the number of individuals in Medicare, Medicaid, and the Veterans Health Administration, so that different people in the audience can get a sense of how this might affect them. You can see that the cost savings with just this small subset of autoimmune diseases could be substantial, anywhere from 24 to 34 billion in total. So what are the big picture potential savings? The cost of autoimmune diseases are staggering. Around 4.5 billion in 2019 dollars was attributed to Social Security's disability and supplemental income related expenses. There are over 1.3 million hospitalizations per year for people with autoimmune diseases. If we can reduce that just 25% by following a dietary protocol, there would be greater than $5 billion savings. If we could switch people from a biologic to either MTM or MTG, we could potentially save $24 to $33 billion. Not to mention the indirect savings from people feeling better, taking less time off of work, and improved productivity. The AIP might not be a panacea, but most studies have been very promising and are worth exploring.
Thank you, Joel.
Thank you, Joel. That was awesome and very insightful. And those figures are very powerful and really, it's the reason for this webinar is there are so many opportunities to do something here. So quick announcement. So I see that that you're not able to use the chat and communicate with each other. Apologies for that. It probably wouldn't be a webinar if we didn't have some tech hiccup. So let's try the Q&A and see if that works, if what you're able to post on there can be viewed by everybody else. If not, what we can do is share those in the follow-up email. So if you want to share a link or a resource or a comment, we'll make sure to share those. So now we're going to switch gears and we're going to hear from Brian Bentow. He's going to share his powerful, insightful, and very personal experience with an autoimmune disease, as well as how he overcame the disease through diet. Thanks in advance for sharing your story. Brian?
My name is Brian Bento, and I'm a serial tech entrepreneur and now the CEO of Get Saucy and an autoimmune disease patient advocate. When I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, my gastroenterologist recommended that I go on Entyvio. I decided to do my own research and learned that it can cause liver damage and other serious side effects and is only effective for 44% of patients. So I went to a functional medicine doctor who told me about the autoimmune protocol diet. Within 2 months of being 100% compliant with the diet, all my symptoms resolved. I went back to my doctor and I showed him my blood test results and stool test results, my biomarkers for inflammation, including C-reactive protein, calprotectin, lactoferrin, and IgA, had dropped by over 90%. And my doctor was amazed. He said, "Wow, this is incredible. Which treatment are you on?" And I said, "No treatment." And then he said, "Well, what are you doing?" And I told him I'm doing the diet. And he said, "Well, if you had these results and you're on the medication, I would be ecstatic." Then he explained why he hadn't recommended the diet himself. He said, "I'm not a registered dietitian. And when I went to medical school 40 years ago, I got a textbook this thick and only one page was on nutrition. And in all of these years, I've only had one other Crohn's patient who did a diet. He healed. I even did a colonoscopy on him and I looked at his intestinal lining and it completely healed. But after a year, he got tired of cooking everything from scratch and he went back to his old habits and his symptoms came back. And then I put him on the medication. And that's why I don't recommend the diet because I don't think it's sustainable." And he was sort of right. Cooking meals from scratch was time consuming and exhausting. And I looked for off the shelf ready made sauces for the AIP diet for global cuisine, like I was used to using before I was diagnosed, but I couldn't find any. So eventually I decided to outsource cooking of my meals to a personal chef. However, I still really wanted those ready-made sauces that I could use to cook at home. And that's how my partnership with Chef Suhan began. He's a top 1% chef with a passion for bold and creative, globally inspired flavors. He was the only chef that I could find who was able to successfully recreate the global flavors that I missed and make them compliant with the AIP diet. And we decided to turn it into a product line that makes compliant, flavorful, flexible mealtime accessible to everyone. And that's how Get Saucy was born. Our mission is simple: to bring people delicious, globally inspired sauces and seasonings that make eating easy, enjoyable, and inclusive so that anyone, no matter their dietary needs, can reclaim the joy of mealtime without the stress of cooking everything from scratch. Get Saucy is helping solve the missing link in the medically tailored meal ecosystem for autoimmune diseases, which are easy to cook, ready-made sauces for global cuisine that are compliant with restricted diets and making them ubiquitous. Get Saucy is currently selling its products direct to consumer. Get Saucy provides culturally resonant flavors like tikka masala, Thai curry, tomato-free marinara, and more to give patients access to their favorite meals. We are working directly with organic farms in the US to source our ingredients and make sure that we have adequate supply. Prevention. Get Saucy's products are free of ultra-processed ingredients and they are organic. They're great for people with a family history of food allergies or autoimmune diseases or just want to eat clean, nutrient-dense food. Transitioning from the hospital. Whether patients are in the hospital or transitioning out of the hospital to at-home care, our products can support their nutritional needs without triggering their immune system. For patients whose conditions are food modulated, patients can avoid their food triggers more easily when there is a convenient, cost-effective solution as we have seen with celiac disease. We want to be the Chipotle of healthcare, and we support Speed Scratch. You can choose your protein, chicken, tofu, lamb, beef, etc. Choose your sauce, tikka masala sauce, orange chicken sauce, Thai curry, tomato-free marinara. Then choose your carb, starchy vegetable, brown rice, white rice, pasta, etc. And you can have a delicious meal within minutes. The sauces are the delivery vehicle for flavor and nutrient density. We centralize the hardest part, the making of the sauces. Many people can cook their own proteins, vegetables, and carbs like rice or pasta, and then just add our sauce. Our products are made using whole natural ingredients, almost exclusively from farms in the US. They meet the requirements for nutrient density and have no refined sugar, seed oils, ultra-processed foods, and are top 15 allergen-free. They're compliant with many restricted diets, including AIP, Paleo, Whole30, Mediterranean, and more. We started by launching direct-to-consumer on our website, Amazon, and an online marketplace called Shop AIP, so individuals can enjoy our product at home. Next, we will launch our ready-made sauces in food service with hospitals, senior living facilities, colleges and universities, and other medically tailored meal companies. Then we will expand to hotels, restaurants, and airlines so people can stick to their diet while they're not at home. We will launch our own ready-made medically tailored meals. We will continue to innovate and add new flavors and products to our lineup, including ketchup, teriyaki, salad dressings, etc. And following that, we will go into specialty retail like Whole Foods, mass market retail, and then international. In summary, we covered the second hit hypothesis for autoimmune disease and the autoimmune disease protocol for disease management. We showed how our products could be used to help patients enjoy their food and avoid their food triggers while realizing significant savings to the government and healthcare system. There is still work to be done to understand the underlying mechanism of autoimmune disease and to scale up the solution. Today, we're focusing on exciting follow-up opportunities that can truly transform how we approach autoimmune diseases with food as medicine. First, we have the launch of a medically tailored meals pilot specifically for autoimmune diseases. This will build upon successful medically tailored meal programs already in place for heart disease and type 2 diabetes. The goal is to develop comprehensive pilot program plans by collaborating with institutional partners, ensuring these initiatives are well-rounded and impactful. Next, we're looking for funding for studies that delve into food-modulated pathways for autoimmune conditions. By leveraging insights gained from the celiac research, we can advance our understanding of these pathways. In addition, supporting randomized controlled trials like those testing the autoimmune protocol diet for conditions such as Sjogren's, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, and Hashimoto's will provide valuable evidence-based insights. Lastly, conducting comparison studies is crucial. These will evaluate the effectiveness of nutritional interventions versus traditional pharmacological approaches, offering a broader perspective on treatment options. Together, these initiatives represent a significant step forward in making therapeutic diets not just a possibility, but a practical reality for those in need.
Thanks to both Joel and Brian for presenting and sharing their invaluable experiences and insights. So when Brian and I first met and talked, I was really struck by, I worked, as I mentioned earlier, in the food as medicine space since 2010, and this was an area that was not on my radar that I hadn't really heard about. And I have family members who have autoimmune disease, so I understood a little bit, but I never thought about the potential for food as medicine addressing these. So Brian mentioned something critical. There are a couple takeaways that we were hoping for from this webinar. One is to make sure that if there are other people out there like myself that are working in this space and have worked in this space for years, that they understand that autoimmune disease is a subset of diet-related disease. And it's, as you can see, it costs a lot of money. We're spending a lot of money on it. It's costing businesses and it's costing the government. It's costing all of us through higher health insurance. And perhaps most importantly, it's affecting people's lives. So there's so much potential here, and what Brian has come up with is a great partial solution. Lots of opportunity here. So let's open it up to questions. I don't believe the Q&A can actually work for everybody to see, but if you've got something to share, go ahead and put it in there. And if it doesn't work, people can't see it, we'll share that in the follow-up email that we provide. But I'm going to pause a second. I'm going to look in the Q&A and see if we've got any questions. Nothing in Q&A.
Well, I
And
see there are a couple open questions. Um, and
okay.
one of the questions I'm going to answer live in regards to, um, we will send out, we're going to take the video, it's being recorded, and we'll make it available. And we'll send it out via email. We may also post it onto LinkedIn. Um, we'll upload it to YouTube, and we'll also share the deck with everybody who registered. So you should get an email. We have everybody's email that they input when they registered.
And then, Brian, there's another question in there. My sister was diagnosed with RA at 18 years old and faces daily chronic pain. I once tried the AIP diet with her, and we had the same challenge. It was really hard to keep up with cooking everything from the scratch to our on our own. Love to see the solution entering the market. So more of a comment, not a question.
Yes. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Alex. And after I was diagnosed, and I thought about the fact that if I had been diagnosed with Crohn's disease, my doctor would have told me to go on the gluten-free diet. But because was diagnosed with Crohn's, uh, and there aren't very many good options, and all of the problems that Joel mentioned, that two patients with Crohn's can have different food triggers, etc. He didn't recommend a diet, and I cooked all my meals from scratch for 3 years, and it took up a lot of time. I didn't get to spend time with my family, or have a lot of time to work out or do a lot of different things. So I did that for 3 years, and once I had some success in my career, I outsourced my cooking to a chef, and that freed up my time. My food tasted better. I was able to go to the gym and work out, go sailing, go kite surfing, um, and really, it really improved my life. And I know that not many people can afford to hire a personal chef, and that's why I want to make these products available, because I saw how it changed my life, and I want to give that experience to everybody else.
All right. Thank you, Brian. And then the next question, are there any circulating immunologic biomarkers that are good indicators of a recent food allergy? And I guess that could be for Joel or Brian or both of you.
Sure. For IgE-mediated food allergies, such as wheat, gluten, and so on, the IgE test is the best test. It's short-lived, and it will detect whether someone had a recent allergic reaction. There are a couple experimental tests that are being looked at to see whether you can detect a recent food allergy, but there's nothing really on the market that I'm aware of that people are using at this point.
Great. Thank you, Joel. We've got another question. Are you partnering with a dietitian, and will you be at the Food and Nutrition Conference in Nashville?
So if you go to our website, getsaucy.com, and you go to our advisory board page, you'll see we have a board of registered dietitians and chefs, and we will be adding some MDs as well to that page. And so we are working with registered dietitians. We also have some registered dietitians that are brand ambassadors for us. And so we're definitely excited and open to working with registered dietitians that are working directly with patients to help them use our products and include them in their meals. Because the registered dietitians in many cases are the front lines to the patients. In terms of, are we going to be at the Food and Nutrition Conference in Nashville? At this time, we are not. Earlier this year, we were at the Fancy Food Show in New York, and we also went to the Future Food Tech. We will have a few folks at FinC that will be talking about Get Saucy that are as attendees. And so we are definitely looking forward to partnering with registered dietitians so they can talk about Get Saucy at events that they are already attending, because we
Great.
are a relatively small team.
Thanks, Brian. And yeah, we understand in my work at USDA, the role of dietitians is critical. I've been at several events where we talk about there really aren't enough of them, and their role is sometimes overlooked, but certainly not with Get Saucy and not in my experience with USDA. We've got a comment from Barry and some resource sharing, so we'll make sure to include that. And thanks for sharing that information, and we'll share that information with the attendees in the follow-up email. Brian or Joel, if there's anything you want to comment on there, Barry from South Carolina, you can just hop in and I'll jump to the next question. What are some of the experimental biomarkers that you alluded to that are not clinically available yet? I'd love to read up on them. Thanks.
So if you wanted to shoot your email into the Q&A, I'll be more than happy to follow up and send you some of that information.
I'll
Okay.
also add briefly that on this slide, you'll see email contact information for all three of us. So I'll just leave that up. If you have any further questions for any one of us, feel free to shoot us an email directly. And obviously you can go to our website. We have our YouTube channel, Instagram, Facebook group, etc. as well.
Yeah, and a follow-up email will include all of that information as well. Mike's got a question for me. How do you see the USDA, HHS, and related state agencies working together to coordinate coverage of medically tailored meals over the next several years? Do you think that this will become a state-by-state coverage issue or supplemental benefit in the long run outside of SNAP and the expiration of waivers? For most people. So this is my own opinion. So there were Medicaid 1115 waivers that were administered by HHS, and the current administration has indicated that they still support those, but it's kind of TBD whether those expand. My personal view is that given the dollars involved, that the system has to move toward prevention. As I mentioned, I've been working on this since 2010. And a couple years ago, I was part of the national federal team that was working on sort of food as medicine and going upstream on working on prevention and coordinating the entire federal government on this. My guess, reading the tea leaves, is that that will continue and expand. As I mentioned, the dollars, I think, will drive that, but that's just my opinion. And then there's another question. I have celiac. Can I be triggered by anything other than gluten? Are there other things we should avoid in our diet? I know there's some crossover, and folks who have celiac also have issues with dairy.
So celiac is kind of defined as a gluten sensitivity and allergy. The interesting thing is there's a lot of people who have genetic markers for gluten, but yet are not sensitive to, have the markers for celiac disease, but for whatever reason still eat gluten and don't have problems. And there's a number of people that have gluten sensitivity, but don't have necessarily celiac disease. There's a lot of cross-reactivity is the wrong word. There's a lot of people that have different responses to different food allergies, and it may be that there's more than one condition going on for many people. So while celiac disease is gluten related, there may be other food sensitivities that a person may have. And so an individual may respond to avoidance of other types of foods as well.
Great. Thanks, Joel. And then there's something from Raquel. In recent decades, wheat has undergone significant genetic modifications and changes in its DNA structure. Do you believe these changes could be one of the reasons why gluten intolerance and sensitivities have become more common in humans?
That is a great question, and it's unknown. Um, the um, there's been a lot of changes, and that's one of the reasons why there's a big push towards eating older style wheats such as emmer and spelt and others to see. And many people state that they are able to tolerate it better in the same way that some people are better able to tolerate sourdough breads as opposed to more modern yeast-based breads. Um, but I think that's still being evaluated at this point. I don't think there's anything definitive about that. Brian, do you have other ideas?
Yeah, I think from the research that I've done, the wheat in the United States tends to be higher protein content than the wheat in Europe, for example. And some people believe that the amount of, the gluten protein in the wheat in the US accounts for the difference. And for example, I will eat sourdough bread using a type of ancient flour that's organic, and it only has 4 ingredients. And it's very helpful for me. It's fermented for 3 or 4 days, and it's well tolerated by people who are gluten sensitive. It's made by this bakery called Moses Bread, and it's in Tustin or so. Um, so it is interesting that a lot of people say that when they eat wheat or bread in Europe, even if they have celiac, it doesn't affect them the same way that wheat or bread in the US affects them. And I think that there is something to do with the amount of uh, gluten protein, or it could, and some people say it could be related to um, synthetic pesticides or fertilizers, Roundup, like glyphosate, etc.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Brian. And I have also heard this from people I know who have celiac who go to Europe. Same thing Brian said. So it seems like there could be something there. There are a growing number of millers in the U.S. sort of that are using heritage grains. There's one that just opened a couple years ago. I think it's called Janie's Downstate, Illinois. You can get it online, but some years ago you could not find flour that was made with heritage grains, or it was difficult to find. They're more and more popular, and people are eating them not just because of celiac, but it'll be interesting to see. I think it's another area that is ripe for study and further research. So thank you for flagging that. And we have one more comment from John about that same topic regarding the question of GMOs. If the changes cause changes in protein structures that are unique, then yes, they would not be recognized as, let me get my as self versus non-self in the immune system, either innately or if introduced later in life in the diet might be recognized as foreign. If, however, the genetic modifications are not introducing any new protein sequences, aka antigens, then there should be no need to worry about it. I don't know if Brian or Joel have anything additional to comment on that.
I'm not sure. I know the modern wheat varieties have multiple genes. So instead of having 12 chromosomes, there's up to 44. So um, it's the modern wheats are very different, and I really don't know whether the antigens that are available in them are different, um, or they're just more of them.
Oh, thank you. And then Sonia, hello from North Carolina. As an entrepreneur introducing a new product, what is the most challenging aspect of making the product available? Is the market crowded by probiotics?
Yeah, so I can take that. I think that I would say this type of a business is extremely difficult. It's like a hardware business, but the hardware expires. You have to do supply chain management. We have quite a few ingredients. The ingredients are seasonal. So just producing the product has its own challenges. And then in terms of selling it, um, direct to consumer, you can sell it on Amazon, which it's very convenient and people like to buy from Amazon, but it's hard to have high margins there. Um, you can sell them on your website. There's a lot of online marketplaces, and we want to make the product available to people and where they are, and where they like to shop. But then we also believe that it's very important to make them available to food service. When we went to the Future Food Tech Conference, somebody came to our booth who works for senior living and said, "We're looking for products just like this. Our population, 85% of them have not autoimmune diseases, but chronic diseases, and many of them have different food triggers. Some of them can't have tomatoes because they're too acidic. They get acid reflux, things like that." And so he was really excited about it. And at the hotel, the executive chef said, "This is amazing because a few weeks ago we had a family come visit us. They called in-room dining and they said, 'Hey, we have all these allergies. Can you make us something?' And we looked at each other. We looked at our queue of tickets and we said, 'Oh my gosh, we don't know what to make that they're going to enjoy. That's not going to make them sick.' And we're super busy and it was very stressful." And he said, "I wish I would have a case of your product on hand in case they come back." And that really got me realizing that I always thought that the biggest problem was for individuals cooking meals at home. But if I make a meal and it doesn't taste good, or if I make myself sick, I'm not going to sue myself. I'm not going to write a negative Yelp review on myself. And so this problem of providing food for people with food allergies and food triggers is much more acute of a pain point for food service providers. And so that's why we think it's really important that we make our sauces available to food service.
Great. Thanks, Brian. And a story that you told me that really resonated was flying overseas. You get meals and you can order meals with certain dietary restrictions before you fly, but there's nothing for anyone with autoimmune disease. And it doesn't matter if you're flying first class or coach, they don't offer anything. So it seems like that is low-hanging fruit for airlines, particularly that want to cater to their premier customers, but really everyone when you think about how people suffer from this disease and they don't have options when they fly a 10-hour flight to Europe.
Yes,
There's a,
I think that's a great point, and that's one of the things that really drives me as well is that I want to be able to enjoy my favorite meals if I'm on a plane, if I'm at a restaurant, if I'm in a hotel. I don't want to have to sit there awkward, not eating anything when I go out to dinner with a group, just drinking water. Or I would fly international to London, and there would be times where I wouldn't eat anything but, say, a banana for 24 hours and drink water because there literally was no food for me to eat at the airport or on the airplane. And there's a lot of people who try to stick to these diets, um, and then give up. And I've heard that story so many times. I did it for 8 months. I did it for a year. I've been doing this diet for 7 years now, longer than almost anyone I've encountered. And 3 years was on my own. 4 years I did it, with having a personal chef. And now I have our products and I use them on a weekly basis. Um, and now I can actually enjoy meals and sit together and eat with my family. And the social aspect of not having to eat by yourself and being able to eat with my wife, with my kids, and make one meal for the whole family instead of having to make separate meals, is just another added benefit of our products. We want them to taste authentic and delicious and be stress-free and, have global cuisines, um, and something that tastes good enough so that you can eat it with, friends, even if you're throwing a dinner party and you have one person who has an autoimmune disease, you know, one other person, doesn't want to have tomatoes or what have you, or gluten or dairy or whatever those particular restrictions are. Um, that's why the sauce format, the ready-made sauces, is super important to us.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. When you think about the cost and there's really that other dimension, which is quality of life. And that's something that's also critical to this conversation. I wanted to mention a comment from Barry, and he mentions we must work together to get the word out that food as medicine is the key to better health and avoiding age-related and other chronic disease. I'm sure he's not referring to me, but maybe to others who are aging. So yeah, great point. And as a communications person at USDA, and even work that I've done, to me, a lot of times it comes down to the communications. Is if we want to build support for initiatives, we need to make sure that we're communicating and not just communicating among the converted or the people that already know, but figuring out how do we communicate with others to drive systems change. And then Barry had also mentioned that glyphosate is a big issue as it is sprayed on crops just before the harvest to dry grains uniformly. It really disrupts the gut. And Raquel, let's see. Raquel is talking about people struggling with misleading food labels. For example, just yesterday, mother-in-law thought she was buying a can of pears with no sugar, but the fruit was packed in liquid containing sucralose. What changes in labeling or marketing do you believe would help consumers make truly healthier choices and avoid this kind of confusion? I have some thoughts about that, but I'll let Brian or Joel uh, answer that first if they have anything to say.
Alan, if you have a succinct answer to that one that we can fit into the time, that would be great.
Sure. And I will mention we've just got a couple minutes. So, and we went a little over, but since we had questions, wanted to do that. So I will say that front of package labeling has been a concern and something that the Biden administration was working on. And through MAHA, it sounds like there's also interest in continuing to do this. My advice to people is always let your elected members know that this is important to you, and you can let the manufacturers know as well. That's about as succinct as I can get. So we're always hoping that we can do more in this area. Uh, Daniel, institutional food service feeds a lot of people every day, schools, hospitals. Let's see, and it's expensive to accommodate restrictions like autoimmune conditions with differing triggers. Medically tailored meals and food as medicine tends to focus on individuals, not institutions, but glad to see you're working this angle also. Okay, and then I want to jump. We had a couple maybe in the chat, and I think we've got just 2 minutes. Let me see if there's anything that we can answer quickly in here. Yeah. Okay. I don't see anything. So if we'll do a review, and if there's something in there, we'll make sure that we include that in the summary email. As we close, I'd like to invite everyone. So our email addresses are on there, and you'll get the follow-up email. Please reach out to us. We also wanted to share the references for the data and the figures that we shared. You'll find those in the following slides, which will be included in a follow-up email to all attendees. So we've shared a lot of facts and figures with you and want to make sure that we're showing you where we're getting this information. If people want to do a little more research or use these, you'll have those. And again, if you have additional questions or insights you'd like to share, please email one of us. You can also find the three of us on LinkedIn. We invite you to connect there and continue the conversation. Thanks again for attending today's webinar. Thank you, Joel and Brian, for sharing your wisdom and experiences. To all of you that are working in this area or interested, thank you for attending and thank you for your work. Enjoy the rest of your day and wishing you all wellness. Take care.